You don't even have to take an ACT to take a credit course. I know that. So I asked Paul, he said, no, there's no requirement.
They haven't.
You can take dual credit courses and never have taken the ACT.
A project under construction
Get to
in
Edgerone when you're
Appleton, Wisconsin.
Is this a work phone?
No, it's my private.
Okay.
That's right. But it's or.
Jerome, it's not,
We were there.
Let me look at that guy.
it's not unheard of to not be able to.
But it's one out. That's all I'm saying.
Usually
Well,
they're
let me see here. As far as me first getting on the
Meeting to order. Oh, there we go. Good afternoon. We'll call the meeting to order. It's great to be here. President Griffiths, thank you so much. What a beautiful venue. We always look forward to coming to Madison, but when we get a brand new building to hold our meetings in, it's even better. So thank you very much for that. We'll start, you've got the agenda in front of you. We'll start. Molly, would you please call the roll?
Adam. Here. Bastion.
Here.
Morgan.
Here.
Robert.
Here.
Here.
Wayne. Here. Kiefer.
Here. Thank you. We have a quorum. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. If you want to hit where it says push, if you hit push again, you will turn it on. This meeting is being live streamed, and these mics pick up a lot of things that are being said around you. So if yours is off but the one next to you is on, you still may get picked up on the mics. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware at the table that we are being live streamed. We're glad anyone out there listening to us on the greater web, we appreciate you being here with us and experiencing this along with us. We'll move on to item 1B, the approval of the agenda, and I'll call on Regent Bastion.
Thank you. I'd like to move a couple changes to the agenda, and they pertain to item number 5 under Planning and Resource Development. What is now 5I, University Center Sioux Falls, I would move changes to 5I1, that we add 5I2, which would be a discussion with regard to the Black Hills State University Rapid City. And finally, remove from the agenda item 5N, N as in Nancy. That was on the agenda because it appeared at the time that there was going to be some discussion that was going to be necessary and some action by the board. That's no longer necessary, so we can take that item off. The item right before it, item M, with regard to the USD Discovery District, Nate will be discussing that with us, and I'm sure if you have any questions about the master ground lease and why it's off the agenda and what occurred there, he'd be happy to discuss that with you, but it will not be an agenda item pursuant to my motion, and that's my motion.
Okay. There's a motion. Thank you, Regent Bastion. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? Everyone have all the changes that were made? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. That motion carries. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just want to point out that there were some time changes on that Wednesday morning. It'll start at 7:30 to 9 for the exec session, and then 9 to 11. So
That's correct. Thank you. Those were emailed out earlier, but thank you, Dr. Rush. 7:30 to 9 a.m. on Wednesday, October 4th. Tomorrow morning, we start at 7:30 instead of 8. That'll run through 9, and then we'll start the executive session from 9 a.m. until 11 a.m. So thank you for that clarification. The next item that we have on the agenda is item 1D, the approval of the minutes and the meetings from August 8th through the 10th, and then August 20th, and those minutes were included in the packets. I would entertain a motion. Moved by Regent Roberts. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Regent Thayers. Thank you. Any discussion on the minutes? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That motion carries. We will then move on to item 1E, the rolling calendar, and I'll actually turn that over to, you have the rolling calendar item, agenda item 1E. I don't know, Mike, if you want me to turn it over to you, but what we're approving are the latest, we keep approving this at each board meeting, but there's one change I would also like to make. It's been worked out for a variety of reasons. Molly might be able to share a little more insight, but the SDSU meeting on May 8th through the 10th of 2018 and the June 26th through the 28th meeting at USD, those two are going to switch. So we're going to be in Vermillion on May 8th through the 10th. So we'll be at USD, and then we'll be at SDSU June 26th through June 28th. That's correct, Molly? Thank you. somebody's retiring or something's going on we have to deal with, I think, in Vermillion. And then the latest meeting, Molly, that was added that we're approving today are the October meeting and the December meeting? Okay, so the October 2nd through the 4th of 2018 at the School of Mines. That will be the newest one added to the rolling calendar. Any questions on those changes? If not, is there a motion to approve? Thank you. Is there a second? Thank you. Seconded by Regent Roberts. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That motion carries. Thank you. We need to go back. I skipped one. I skipped 1C. I apologize for that. Thank you, Dr. Rush. Declaration of conflicts.
President Sutton, Regent Thayers, prior to my appointment to the Board of Regents as a community leader in Aberdeen, I was engaged and involved in the discussion and planning for the new South Dakota School for Visually Impaired School and Facility Program. And so there is no financial gain personally or otherwise, but so there are no conflicts. I will abstain from voting on that piece, 7U.
Thank you, Regent Thayers. 7U. Okay. Any other conflicts? Outside of the pages of conflicts that I've already submitted, I don't think I have any new ones today, so thank you, Nathan. Anything else? We need a motion to do that, Mike, and approve, or are we okay?
I don't think so.
Okay, no problem. Thank you, Regent Thayers. We'll now move on to item 2. We've finished up the board work section. We'll move on to item 2. And 2A is enrollment trends in the university system. The items that we're working off of are kind of the yellowish, not the goldenrod like we have in finance, but the yellowish colors. And item 2A, enrollment trends in the university system. And I'll call on Dr. Rush and Dr. Paul Turman.
Chairman, this afternoon, we, for our workshop topic, thought it was an apropos time to do an in-depth analysis of the enrollment throughout the system. We obviously release an enrollment report and in the fall publicly, but it's a pretty high-level report. And there's a lot of detail underneath that and within our institutions that I think is extremely instructive as we take a look at a lot of our operations. In conjunction with that enrollment report, we're going to look at the high school matriculation report. We're going to also look at our tuition and fee discussion that we started at the retreat. Board members were interested in continuing having that conversation, and so we're going to revisit that. As part of that, there was a significant presentation done by Jeff Melhoff, who works for the Legislative Services Office, and he's here today, and he's going to give that same report to the board that he gave the legislature. I think it had some valuable information for board members, but it's also good to know what the legislature is hearing and make sure we're all on the same page. So we appreciate Jeff's willingness to do that. And so we're hoping for a robust discussion on those two topics.
Thank you, Dr. Rush. Thank you, Dr. Rush. We've got about an hour and 45 minutes to get through these items if we stay on schedule today. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Turman, for item 2A.
All right, thank you, Mr. President, members of the board. I do have a PowerPoint, and I think it'll show up on the back once it's up on my screen. I'm not sure what, he'll come down and get it set. As Dr. Rush noted, this is really a report that's come to the board. This is the third time now. And our goal really is to try to provide you all with a really good interpretation of the enrollment trends that we see within the regional system. Each year in September, we try to provide you and do the media release that articulates what we see happening with the enrollment, the headcount growth that we've had, the FTE growth that we're seeing, or even some years we see some decreases at different institutions. That always doesn't tell, I think, the full story of what's happening with our enrollment trends. So we lose students in one area, we gain them in another. Resident, non-resident, high school student, non-high school student, off campus, on campus, and all of those I think are certainly things that influence the way you make decisions as board members. And so the report itself, I pulled out a couple of the different tables, but I've also tried to provide some visual representation on a variety of new components. But at any point, if you have questions, feel free to stop me as I walk through a couple of the different elements that I think are relevant for the board to better understand what it is that's happening. There we go. So the first one is also up in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. You'll also be able to see I've tried to connect the different figures with where within the report it's showing. So Table 1 and Figure 1 represent basically the growth that we've seen as a system across 3 different areas. So the combination of headcount enrollment that we've experienced dating back to 2008, what our unduplicated numbers have been. And so I think it's always certainly important for board members to understand that we have significant duplication that exists within enrollment reports. So we want to make sure that an institution who's providing services to students in the state are getting credit for that service. So if a student is enrolled in 2 different classes from 2 different institutions, SDSU and USD, in that situation are serving and get those students counted in their head count just in the way we report those to iPads. And so it's also important, I think, to really understand that we have just the overall service to the system. That number is always slightly lower. And so this last year, we had head counts at 36,620 or 36,662, but we had slightly about 3,000 fewer students when you just look at the overall unduplicated count. It's always important to note as well, if you look at the trends that you're seeing on this particular table, the head count, duplicate counts, and then FTE are really following the same types of trends. And if we were seeing instances where that was not happening, where we went way up on head count, but then started to dip in FTE, or go up in FTE, but drop in head count, then those become the types of things that we try to look at and evaluate where at respective campuses are we starting to see trends that are starting to skew some of the trend lines that we see within the system. But I think the more kind of critical one, especially when you've talked about performance funding, we've talked about formula funding models that have been in place in the Regental system, they would always be driven more by the FTE count, so the full-time equivalent students, and those are calculated in different ways. A student who's an undergraduate student taking 15 credits, that increases for graduates or decreases for graduate students. Pharmacy and law all have different calculations. And so in the end, I think that your ability to understand where that FTE number is going is probably the most critical. The second one provides a comparison across each one of the different institutions in the system over the 7-year period that are depicted in the report itself. And so, as you can note, the yellow lines represent the head count, the blue features on the chart itself show FTE. And I'll maybe take you all the way to the far right-hand side, that as a system, we've gone up over the last 7 years at about 222 new students. On the FTE side, that number is far smaller. We've really only grown by about 9 FTE during that same time period. And some of that's by kind of the give and take that occurs at each one of the different campuses. As an example, USD has had a modest increase in head count, but a very significant increase in FTE. And so what that's really showing, at least at that institution, that the students they're attracting or the students that they're serving, those students themselves are taking more credit, or at least they're exchanging students. Students might graduate, have completed part-time credit, only taken 6 credit hours a semester, but the influx of new students is bringing their FTE count up beyond what their head count had been. Those institutions, about the inverse is simply is happening at SDSU. Lower FTE counts, lower number of head count that they have at that institution, but the trade-off is most likely that they're serving more part-time students than what they did back in 2010 when the chart are being depicted there. So those are represented in Table 2 and also Figure 2 of the report itself. Another way to look at this, and certainly one of the most important, I think, trends is our transition of students from the traditional face-to-face classes on campus. Certainly something that has been occurring significantly over the past decade in the Regents system. But what you see if you go to the far left-hand or right-hand side is that as a system, we've lost about 1,200 students taking and enrolling in classes on campus. Versus about a 1,400 increase in the number of students who are taking classes off campus. So I think it's important for us to try to operationalize for you how we make a determination of an on-campus versus an off-campus student when we do these types of reporting. So if a student is enrolled on campus, so say here at DSU, and then they also are taking classes off campus, when it comes to head count, what we try to do is if you're enrolled on a face-to-face campus somewhere, then you're counted as an off-campus student. If you only take off-campus, I'm sorry, it's the inverse, you're an on-campus student. If you take at least one class on campus for headcount reporting, you're considered on campus. If you take only off-campus courses, then you fall into that mix. And so the headcount number for those that are in the on-campus has a mixture of both off-campus and on-campus delivery. But I think it's most important to best understand the number of students who are on this campus in a dormitory and engaging in the services and the support that come from the local community campus itself. So all the other off-campus would fall certainly into those being served by the university centers, as well as those that are taking just exclusively online courses. So each one of our campuses have certainly seen some mix, a give and take in that. DSU, as well as South Dakota School of Mines, are the two that have not seen decreases in their off-campus, but have grown in both the on-campus and off-campus enrollments over the last 7 years. This chart provides kind of the where we see ourselves essentially potentially intersecting at some point down the road in the future. So going back to fall 2010, and these are in the appendices. Tables A3A and A3B depict basically for each one of the campuses and the system what that off-campus and on-campus enrollments have been. We had about 21,000 students. That's dropped to about 19, so we've lost about 2,000 students over this time period who are taking a combination of classes on campus or off campus or exclusively on campus in our institutions. And that's grown by about 2,000 on the other end of the spectrum. And so I think what you're seeing, if you go back to that first table that I showed, head count after about 2010, we have been relatively flat. The transition in between where students are taking those courses certainly is very dynamic within the Regents system. And I think that's something that the first time we brought this report to the board 2 years ago, those were the types of things that it was certainly highlighting, and I think those trends are still occurring. Question?
Mr. President.
Sorry.
Regent Schaefer.
Paul, are you, I'm looking for that chart. Are we looking at, our attachment doesn't have that.
Yeah, our attachment is different, Regent Schaefer, there's no question. The attachment we have is a different report. This looks like a PowerPoint that you put together, Paul, but we have is the enrollment trends.
Yes.
But not the same charts are not included in here. Some are, but they.
This chart itself is not. It comes from the data that's in table A3 and A3, or A3A, A3B. So it'd be on page 11 and 12 of the report that was provided to the board in advance. Yeah.
All right, thanks. I just wanted it because they're important. They're telling charts, so I appreciate that.
Regent Schaefer, I think, Dr. Turman, if we could actually get a copy of the
I will.
PowerPoint at some
Yep.
point too, that'd be great. Thank you.
One of the things that, and this one was a difficult one to try to depict, and it was something that after I worked through this one to really try to show, is there still, or how much of that activity is occurring on the campus for an on-campus student? So is a student enrolling at one of our institutions, living in the dorm, taking face-to-face courses, but at the same time are engaged in a number of off-campus activities, whether that be online or traveling down to one of our regional off-campus centers. And so I'd probably focus you over on the far right-hand side again for the system. So that 19,240 is the number that what our on-campus enrollments were last year for the overall kind of FTE that we have as a system. What the 1,867 or 1,867 is showing is the number of FTEs that are generated off campus for those students. And so what we're seeing is about 2,000 FTE are captured by students who are on our campuses engaged in the face-to-face, but they're choosing some of the other options that are out there. I think this is one of those things that a lot of times presidents would certainly note that we're not capturing everything. If you just simply go to a straight, it's on-campus or off-campus FTE, because it's failing to capture the fact that they're providing just as many services to those equivalent students as they are to the ones who are taking exclusively everything face-to-face at their institutions. This is also something that varies a little bit at each one of the campuses. Like South Dakota School of Mines has very few of their students who are arriving on campus, taking their face-to-face courses, and then also taking distance courses at the same time. The mix at SDSU and USD certainly are much higher. They equate very closely, I think, what their enrollment numbers are. But it's also important to note that you would expect School of Mines to be lowest, because when you look at their overall off-campus activity, it also is relatively modest. They do not have a lot of online programs. They do not deliver a lot of online courses. And so by default, most of the curriculum that they have is there for their students to be able to take on campus, which is why those numbers are relatively smaller. So this is again, not in here, and I'll put this, I'll provide this PowerPoint for the board so that they can see kind of the nuances that are occurring at each one of the regional institutions. This is showing the overall change in headcount based on residency. Another thing that certainly is very important to the board. You've all made some policy decisions here over the last few years to highlight, encourage more non-resident students to attend our regional campuses. And so as a system, what we've seen is that the number of resident students that we're serving has gone down by about 2,500 students. One of the things I'm going to show you in the report after this is that we haven't changed that much when it comes to our ability to attract high school students in the state. We've stayed relatively consistent on that number. So if we're losing resident students, it tends to be probably more at the those that are non-traditional students or students that have started and then ultimately left before they've completed their degrees, compared to what we have for the non-resident students. But we've certainly grown by about 2,800 non-resident students during this time frame, and you can see across each one of the institutions the give and take, and I think this is reported in the report. It's in Figure 4. There's two different tables that are showing FTE and the head count for the regional system in each one of the different campuses. So the one that's probably grown the most, as you would expect, South Dakota State University has had about 1,200 non-resident students compared to a loss of about 1,400 resident students in their overall equation for what their enrollments look like at their institution.
Dr. Turman, just one question, just so I understand what you're saying correctly, and if I missed it, I apologize. We're not losing out on resident students that are coming directly out of high school, is what I think I heard you say. It's other types of students, perhaps non-traditional students, others. But when you look at the percentage of students, or the number of students that are graduating from our high schools and coming to our institutions, that number is not declining at this rate.
No, and that has stayed within about less than 100 up or down in any given year. And when I get to that part of the report, I'll kind of highlight it specifically. What I would say is where we're probably losing some of these students, because it's important to note that we have a lot of one credit. I mean, students who are individuals who are professionals, they're going on to get their master's degree, they're taking 3 credits to finish up a degree slowly. So those filter into this account. We have people that go on for continuing ed credit that are getting 1 credit hour. And so we certainly were losing in the mix of those students somewhere if we're losing non-residents, but we're not doing it on the high school graduate side of the equation.
But one follow-up to be clear, and there's a chart on page 10 that's university headcount residents, figure 6. I just want to make sure your number here that you have where it shows a decline of 2,500 or whatever, 2,600 roughly, does that take into account what I call the gap, those students that are taking residents that are high school students? I mean, does that include that up there?
It would include those students too, yes,
Okay.
into this.
So if we were not including, what I assume you mean when you say resident high school students are dual credit students.
Yes,
If you were not taking into account dual credit students, that drop would be even more significant.
yes. it
It'd
would.
be another roughly 3,000 decline on the 2,500.
It would, but you'd almost have to go back to, it would probably be more along the lines of 2,000 more. Because we've always had high school students
Okay.
into the mix. It just hasn't been as dramatic as what it's been since the high school dual credit program began.
But if your number 2,000, I know that's just a guess, but then that number would be a negative 4,500 as opposed to a negative 2,500.
If I only did college-age resident students, that would be what you'd see in that table.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
President Sutton, I do. Question, Dr. Kerman, maybe you're going to get to this, but figure 1 shows, basically since 2010, our university system enrollment's been relatively flat. And I've seen in previous graphs where since 2010 is when the state share of funding education dipped below the 50% and is continuing to dip below, costing more, being pushed to the student tuition. Do you think there's any correlation between that and why our enrollments have stayed flat? When, previous to that, we've seen some pretty nice increases, while high school's enrollment stayed about the same. It seems like there's some direct correlation there. Do you feel that, or?
I would have to say, Mr. President, I would say that certainly cost is one of those factors that influences students' decision-making practices. So looking back at that X graph that Monty normally incorporates into the fact book, it was the year before we saw that dip is when it finally hit that 50% mark. And then we certainly went up to where we're at now. And it would have to be attributable to some effect, yes. Students are making those types of decisions. I'd have to go back. The unfortunate thing is we don't have matriculation data going back that far to be able to compare what was the total number of high school students that we were getting back in 2010 compared to what I have depicted in the next report that we'll talk about. They have to be related, yes.
Mr. President,
Regent Schaefer.
follow up to Regent Thayer's comment. I think during that same time period, our system has gone from the second lowest tuition and fees in the region to now the second highest.
Mr. President, and that will also get into the third report too, in looking at kind of what those regional comparisons are and comparing their enrollment growth. And there's some nuances there because those that have lowered their rate to be cheaper than our resident rate have also not experienced significant enrollment increases either. And so I think there's two things that are kind of causing some sort of intersection in the way that students are making choices to leave the state to enroll in other post-secondary or making choices to not go on at all. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to that section.
Okay. Regent Schaefer.
Yeah, Dr. Herman, just listening to your answer just now, I'm just kind of extrapolating a little bit, but that sounded more like a notional response as opposed to a scientific response. And if I followed correctly, you said there may be a lack of data in South Dakota on a causal connection between a higher financial responsibility on the student in percentage terms versus this. Certainly logical, intuitive, and everything else, but has there been any kind of scientific analysis done of that, or do we have the data in any kind of format to do a scientific analysis of any causal relationship or correlation factor there?
Mr. President, I think it'd be difficult to do a causal. I mean, you'd have to specifically do a study and ask those students.
Right.
So what was the factor, the single factor that made your decision to either enroll with us, not enroll, or go out of state? And is cost that primary thing?
And then the next question that would lead to, is there any, South Dakota certainly isn't unique in that regard. That trend is, at least by my last time I looked at it, was somewhere around 80+% of the states are kind of in that same trend where the state percentage is going down, and we've sort of done the same crisscross. Any national data or studies that you're aware of that look at that correlation?
Not that I've
That
seen.
have done those interviews?
I certainly know that, I mean, across the country, enrollment numbers continue to decline.
Yeah, understand that.
So, I mean,
But there's a lot of other things happening
There's
across the country
a
as
lot
well.
of different
This
things
is
that are
a data
impacting that.
point.
Yeah, and it's difficult to, is it cost? Is it the amenities that are there at the institution?
Fair
So,
enough. I've spent enough time trying to figure out the cost issue. Even when you ask a student, when it gets right down to it, even those surveys aren't terribly indicative of what's really going on in somebody's mind. But anyway, fair enough. Thank you.
Since we talked about high school students, I think it's always important to certainly understand how they factor into the equation of both our FTE as well as our overall head count as a system. Note that we started to see certainly our biggest spikes in 2014 when that program was put in place. Prior to that, we were generating about 200 FTE each year in high school students, whether that be dual credit. We also did have a small number of students that were enrolling at our institutions and paying full price. And we have, within our admission policy, the ability for those students to do that. So you have a mixture of both concurrent credit and high school enrollments happening prior to 2013. But here, this most recent fall, we had about 3,000 students that were in concurrent credit, high school, dual credit programs enrolled in our institutions. And it's generating just short of 900 FTE across the system. And so that's an extremely important contextual piece as you consider what the enrollment growth has been here over the last few years. And so it goes back to Regent Thayer's earlier comment. We've certainly, if you throw high school students out of the mix, we haven't really maintained ourselves. We've actually declined significantly in the overall enrollments. And is cost that driver? We need to dig into that certainly more to assess how we can give you the information you need to make those decisions. This table, it's pulling data from table 6 in the board item itself, just simply tracking. So if we're taking out the head count of students in our overall head count numbers, it drops us down to about 33,000 students, 33,627, compared to the 36,000 that we have. And so we have a number of these that are also duplicated. So if we throw high schools out of that unduplicated number that was on that first graph that I showed would also be slightly impacted to some extent. So I think the things that, as I have conversations with Dr. Rush, with the campuses, and also with Monty, there are some serious cost implications beyond just tuition and fee revenue that the institutions acquire. So think that you've got, if I back up here, if I can back up here, you've got about 900 FTE, so it's an average student taking 15 credit hours a semester, and you calculate the number of credit hours that generates. The institution is earning about half of the tuition and fees that they did, which means then Monty is only pulling out about half of the HEF revenue that would have been attributed to that student if they did show up and we were able to collect the credit hour revenue at the full rate once the student arrived on campus. And so, I don't know, Monty would be able to tell, it's like less than $40, it's $29. Yeah, about $29 of the 145 gets pulled out and essentially is put into the HEF fund to keep ourselves whole over time. So in addition to just the credit hour loss for the institution, how it goes into the way that they fund their programs, especially in decentralized business models. There are good implications to certainly consider. And I think one of those reasons why us maintaining or managing this more effectively is going to be extremely critical. If the state isn't interested in helping us build buildings, at the very least, maybe the right tuition rate for high school dual credit is this, in addition to what we need to maintain HEF and keep our facilities in line with what the board wants on the 10-year capital plan. I think lastly, just wanted to provide, and this also is depicted in Figure 6 in the report itself, what these high school enrollments would look like when you compare resident students in the system. We see kind of an overall decrease, and I think I was saying it'd be another 2,000 on top of that, but we're seeing about probably a 3,000, little more than 3,000 fewer students in the Regental system over the time period that we have been tracking. Lastly, I think it's important just to continue to reinforce the fact that we do have a very sophisticated dashboard. Most of the tables that you have seen that are in this report are things that we can update very quickly from the dashboard, but it also provides opportunities to go in and look at each individual institution. I just simply took a quick snapshot where you can see if we have all campuses and we're looking at the university as the primary indicator, you can see kind of where each one of the institutions fit. But you can look at age ranges, residency status, a combination of age and residency to get at some of those questions. What students that were traditionally resident students we normally had in the system are we losing? So we can better try to assess those factors and use it as a means of determining do we make clear distinctions, or do we need to make more distinctions between what a resident and a non-resident rate should be within the Regental system? But hopefully the report gives you a better contextualized way of looking at our enrollment numbers and our FTE counts and where we're seeing increases and decreases over the past 7 to 10 years. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about the report itself.
Any questions of Dr. Terman?
One more.
You bet.
You know,
Regent
Table
Davis.
6 says in your detail there, that the system resident headcounts have fallen by over 5,300 since 2010, a drop of 20.8%. I think that's alluding to my point that since 2010, since the state's share is less, tuition's more, to me, there's got to be some correlation there to why these kids aren't going on to our institutions. I would be interested to get some research done that could do some questions, or how is there, maybe it's when it's passed, it's gone, you can't get it, but I personally believe there's got to be some correlation there between cost of college tuition and why these enrollments have gone down for the resident student.
You said in reference to Figure 6,
Yes.
page 10? Okay.
It says the resident headcounts have dropped by over 5,300 students since 2010. That's kind of what I was getting at. Since 2010 is when the state share dropped below 50, and it's being pushed more and more, continues to be pushed more and more to the student. I think there's some relationship to why these drops are in relation to where tuition's at.
Dr. Terman, my question on that same Figure 6 is a little bit different, but I think it's related to that. Do we know, I want to see if I can get to the other side of that issue. Do we know that of those residents, high school students that are in dual credit, what is the, I don't know what the word is, but what's the retention number or the stickiness that we get from them taking dual credit than them showing up in the fall at our institutions?
How are they retained once they get
No,
to us?
no,
Or
and
do they
I mean
come to
retention.
us?
Yeah, do they come to us? The idea is that if they're taking those dual credit courses, are they coming to us? And are we tracking that? Do we know the percentage of those students that are taking those courses that end up at our institutions?
Last year, I think it was the October meeting, I provided the financial analysis report, which used those kind of differentials of those that came and did not. It tended to be about 51% of the students that we enrolled in those credit hours did not arrive at the Regental system the next fall. So I'll have a new update, which will track 2 more years of those figures. But if you compared, when I compared that to the previous year matriculation numbers, they were almost identical. So of the students I mean, it did not change anybody's behavior in their first year. I'm hopeful that it will change behavior into the future years. Otherwise, I think similar to what we talked about at the retreat, at my Academic Affairs Council retreat, we had some serious conversation about how do we structure this in a different way, that it's really a benefit that the legislature wants to provide to students who have an intent to stay in South Dakota. And if they don't, what would be other mechanisms that we could utilize to either assess additional transcript fees or some other things that might come along the lines of this is perceived as a scholarship program for high school students who want to stay in the state of South Dakota. So I think there's certainly some things that we can look at, but at this point, it has not shown that it's helped us get more students into the Regental system.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Regent Roberts,
just in
go ahead.
follow-up to that, so 51% don't go to colleges, but is it a breakout of privates and then out of state? Do we have that breakout? Like, or, do you know what I'm saying? The legislature would care about that probably.
Mr. President, the only thing I looked at was, did they stay in and attend a Regental institution? A number of these students are certainly going to technical institutes. They are staying at privates and then out of state. We didn't do a national student clearinghouse match against this one, but I think we will this year when I bring the new financial report. So it's important. I mean, on the financial perspective, I wouldn't say we benefit. I mean, because the long-term implications for a student arriving and paying tuition for the remaining 3 years that they have is certainly more beneficial to an institution. But if we're delivering dual credit to students that we never were going to attract, there still is revenue to be made from those students. And to go back to the point I made earlier, we're getting HEF revenue from those students that we would not have assessed because they would have gone to University of Nebraska and never showed up at one of our campuses. So it's complex in just really understanding it.
But if the idea behind dual credit is a low-cost option, which it is certainly for the students and the parents, that is not necessarily that loss leader is not getting people in the door, at least in our first year analysis.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think the other important thing to reinforce about high school dual credit is that this really is a Governor Dugard initiative. There is no state statute that establishes that this program has to continue on. A future governor may determine that this is not something they want to invest, and they'll shift those $3 or $4 million into another program. And so we could see a significant decrease in our headcount if this program were to go away. And I think that's really dependent on both the legislature wanting to step up and implement it somehow, or even future governors down the road. So how it looks, I think the Regents certainly want to be involved in structuring what the next decade of high school dual credit in this state looks like.
Thank you. Other questions of Dr. Turman? Okay, thanks, Paul.
Considering the time, making sure that Monty and Jeff have time to kind of walk through their reports. The matriculation report, as well as the regional enrollment-based tuition fee rates, really were questions that I think you all had at the August retreat, and trying to follow up and just making sure that you have a little bit more information about what matriculation looks like in the regional or within South Dakota, and then how that seems to be impacting the types of numbers that we see for the regional institutions around the country. And so I'll simply turn you to table 1 on page 3 of the report and give you a sense about what it's trying to show. The top table just provides you the overall breakdown in kind of frequency numbers for the students that graduated from South Dakota high schools. That first, the bolded column that has total on it would provide you, I mean, in 2010-11, the high school graduates that year, we had about 8,900 students who had graduated. The next year we had about 8,900. So the total number of graduates in the state of South Dakota at public institutions or public school districts is not changing that much. It stayed relatively flat. When you then go down and begin to look at where is it that those students went, if they did go on. So the top row is showing let me use 2014-15 as an example. In 24-15, so the graduates from, in May 15, 2,846 of them did not go on to any type of post-secondary within the first 16 years. We know that 5,900 of those students did. The next 3 or 4 rows below tell you exactly what types of sector those students went into. We had 1,666 who went on to an out-of-state institution of some kind. We had 3,213 that went to the Regents system. We had 1,200 of those students, almost 1,300 that went on to a technical institute. And then the remaining went to proprietary or private institutions in the state of South Dakota. Table 2 really is just showing you the percentages that are reflected in Table 1, because trying to put them all together in a table was starting to be too complex. But I think it's important to look at the Regents system's percentages over that 5-year period that we do have data for. So in those that graduated in May 11, 34.4% showed up at the Regents system. We had 34.7% the next year, 34.3%. We have dropped a little bit, about a percentage point, 33.7, and then again, a little bit lower this year at 33.3. So we're seeing a little bit of a decline, but the raw numbers themselves are not changing that dramatically from year to year. So the important thing is, because we have to look at the 16-month window reporting requirement that the Department of Ed, that's how we get access to their data. We're always a year and a half behind in being able to show, so what will be the impact on our high school graduates that graduated last in May in 2017. Table 3 and Table 4 basically show that same data, but just simply the distribution across each one of our regional institutions. So you can see where those students are attending. The highest percentage are arriving at South Dakota State University, equivalent to their enrollment numbers. About 14% of the high school graduates over the last 5 years have gone on to that institution. But as an average for the system, we've had about 34% of those students arrive to us. The technical institutes have not seen dramatic increases as well. I mean, they're going anywhere between, 11.5, but their average over that time period was 12, even though they went up about 2% here in the most recent year that we have. But looking at their enrollment releases, it's very difficult to determine how many of their enrollment growths are depicted by high school dual credit. They tend not to release a lot of FTE numbers for us to really compare ourselves against that often, so it's really difficult to assess what's going on there. But overall, I think what we're seeing is that the institutions are doing, I think, a very effective job of maintaining the total number of students that are arriving at our institutions. What is not going to be depicted in this report are going to be two different things. So the college application campaign rolling up now to, we had 40 school districts last year that were a part of that. We're working with 80 here this fall, and we'll have all of them next year. And then proactive admission is one of those that you'll see a report on tomorrow, that we're certainly working toward finding ways to encourage more of our high school students to enroll at our institutions. Whether that be the students that are the high achievers at their campuses or at their school districts, or students who are taking the ACT but then eventually not showing up anywhere within the 16 years. It seems to be that pool that we should be aggressively tackling, because they have demonstrated their capacity to be successful in high school, which would certainly transition once they arrive at one of our campuses sometime in the future. I provide just a very quick narrative, actually, that Molly Hall-Martin helped develop using the matriculation dashboard at the very end of the report, just kind of looking at those underrepresented student populations. We're not certainly making a lot of gains in those areas, but I think the two different projects certainly are designed as a way to work with those schools that do not matriculate a lot of students onto post-secondary. We essentially use that matriculation dashboard as you go in, you can sort, and you can find the school that has the fewest number. I mean, down as many as 5% of their graduating class goes on to post-secondary compared to the state average. Those are the schools that we started with the proactive admission, or with the college application campaign, and we're working our way up that chart to get more of them understanding the benefits that they can gain from going on to post-secondary of some kind. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the matriculation report.
Questions of Dr. Terman?
President Thayer's here again. I'm sorry, I don't know, asking questions because I'm the new guy or just a numbers guy, but on table 1 and 2, you talk about the percent, the 16,745, that's the 34.1%. 34.1% of what number? I'm looking at the average for the whole period. Basically, what you're saying is the 16,000 equates to 34.1%. 34 that's 1% of what number?
It would be of the, if you go up to the top, it ends up being of the 29,711 students. 34% of those eventually came to the regional system. But it also would incorporate I guess it would incorporate the total. It's the 44,000. We're getting.
That's not correct either. I'd get 37.5% with my calculator, so I don't know.
If you're doing the
I
16.
calculate wrong. The 16,745 divided by the 44,537 is like 37.5%. Or did I do it wrong?
I'll check the math, but
Let's
the
see, tell me-
intent was to do what you're describing, yes, that it's what percent of all the graduates eventually within 16 months are in the regional system. But I'll double check to make sure that the numbers are reflected that way.
President?
Yep, Regent Morgan.
Yeah, on that same table, Paul, in 2014-15, just for example, the 59-56, that they attended somewhere. And are the numbers down below the 3, 4, 5, and 6 number, are they supposed to add up to that 5,900, or am I misunderstanding something? Because they don't.
That's the conversation, Regent Morgan, that Regent Schieffer and I were just having. Those numbers do not add up to the 5956.
Not sure they're supposed to, if you look at the,
That's my question. Are they
Out of
supposed to?
state, regental,
Walk us through how
privates,
that
and
works.
private. Yeah.
They should. I'll double check to see. The intent was they should. So I'll assess what's wrong with my math.
but they don't in any of them though, so it's more than math, it's a formula if that's the case.
Okay.
I was thinking it was an out-of-state thing, but
No, you can just take a look at it.
Regent Sutton pointed out the error of my ways, as he so often does.
Any other questions on the matriculation report? Thank you, Paul, and just get back to us with what you find with those tables, if you could, please. Okay. Anything else for Dr. Sherman while he's in the chair?
Just quick, 2B is the follow-up to the
Oh, yeah.
report from I think Monty had provided you with a breakdown of the tuition and fee rates at each one of the regional institutions. The board had questions about the number of high school students that eventually enroll at those. Table 1 shows the total number for each one of those schools based on those that fall below what our average tuition and fee rates would be. Table 2 shows the total number that are going on to the ones that have higher tuition rates than what we have. Overall, you have about 65% of those who left the state during this time period attending institutions that certainly have higher rates. You can see in comparing some of the ACT scores as well, they're certainly attracting more of our high talented students, and I would argue that when you look at most of the scholarship programs that these institutions have, a 24, as University of Nebraska as an example, a 24 on the ACT gives you automatically a $13,000 scholarship to bring you within $1,000 of resident rates at that institution. So a number of these other campuses have very similar types of programs that are like that. So the last thing, when you look at it's on page 5 of the report, I've tried to highlight those in blue so you can separate out the institutions that have lower tuition rates without having to add that field in there. And you can see what the enrollment growth has been for those institutions. Certainly, not all of them have grown. Actually, the majority of them have have decreased in enrollments despite having lower tuition rates for out-of-state students. It's difficult to see if they also have comparable rates for their in-state students as well. I'd be happy to answer any questions on the report.
Regent Bastian.
Paul, I just, maybe this is obvious, but when I was looking at Table 2, and where South Dakota kids are paying more than they would in South Dakota, and we've got a lot of kids attending that have an ACT of more than 25%. I presume that this table doesn't take into consideration whether or not those kids were given scholarships by those out-of-state schools.
Mr. President, that's correct. We would have no way of knowing
Yeah.
what their scholarship amounts were, other than looking at what would be, what are their automatic scholarship programs that they have. A certain ACT score gives you automatically this. We'd need to do that for each one of them. But we have no way of knowing what like the 58 students that went to Iowa State, we can tell which students went, but we'd have no way of showing what their financial aid package looked like at that campus.
Yeah, I guess just when I first saw that, I thought, gosh, we've got a lot of South Dakota students that are paying a lot to go to another college, and then when you look at the ACTs, I'm thinking, well, no.
They're probably not.
There's scholarships, and they probably would have gotten scholarship offers within the regental universities as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, thank you.
Dr. Truman, I think on that same table, Table 2, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Regent Bastian's observation is very good. We just don't know what they're getting in scholarships. But I look at a few of these, and I want to make sure, if you look at Montana State in Bozeman, the published non-resident rate of 24,000, then the South Dakota approved rate of 10,113. That's obviously through WUI, and that is for about 10 kids, if that. I mean, because it's a very limited number, and they make that very clear when you're there. The vast majority of those 53 students from South Dakota, even with ACT over 25, aren't getting in there for $10,000. How do we distinguish that?
I'd have to have Monty tell you that those were the numbers that he has in his report.
Okay, I'm just curious
Yeah.
because you have to meet, you got to have above a 29, and you have to have something else, and you have to be in a certain percentage of your class to get that. I assume is the WUI rate,
I would assume that it is.
and that's the best rate a South Dakotan can get there. But that doesn't mean every South Dakotan going there is getting. Okay, that's what I want to make sure that I clarify that. In my mind, I don't know where else that's the case. But certainly at those Montana, I think there and probably the University of Montana, that difference between the 20 and the 10 is for very, very selected students.
I think we continue to get requests from parents quite often about being a part of the MHEC tuition rate structure as well. And, I think we've certainly been resistant to doing that for a variety of reasons. I think whether it encourages more students to leave the state and whether or not this board is the one that should engage in making those types of decisions. But I know that we'll have something going to AAC here very soon to at least begin to discuss that with our council and then eventually filtering that to BAC. That then would impact these other schools based on how they function very similar to each other.
From the broader picture perspective, I think the important part of this report is Table 1. The fact still remains that South Dakotan students can still attend 14 institutions in our border state cheaper than they can attend ours.
That's correct.
Any other questions of Dr. Turman? Thank you, Paul. Thank you. We appreciate those reports. We will move on to item 2C, the retreat follow-up discussion on tuition and fees. Monty and then Jeff, but Monty, I think you're going to start this, aren't you? Thank you. Dr. Kramer?
At the closure of the discussion at the August retreat, President Sutton asked that we bring this discussion back to the board at this meeting so that we could revisit some of these discussion topics as we continue to talk about, obviously, all of this great enrollment information, as we continue to talk about what tuition and fees and the impact that could be having on enrollments. And so what the board asked us to do was to come back to this meeting and present information on those topics that we discussed at that meeting, and I left it sitting over here. They slide. So what I tried to do from the report, rather than 20 pages of information, I tried to condense it a little bit here and just raise the key points that you saw at the August retreat. And so we talked a lot about the history of the rates and the fact that at one point in time we had standardized rates, then we moved away from standardized rates, and then now we're back to standardized rates again for the most part. And that was the action that the board took at the March meeting. When we look at the surrounding states, there certainly is a distinction in pricing for research universities when you compare them to comprehensive universities. And the Carnegie classification is what I'm using when I make that statement. Our institutions are classified based on the program offerings that they have, the number of master's degree programs, the number of doctoral programs. And so they get categorized as Black Hills, Dakota State, and Northern as being comprehensive institutions, SDSU, School of Mines, and USD as being research universities, doctoral research universities. And so out of the states that differentiate the pricing, almost 46 of those states differentiate at a higher cost for research universities than they do for comprehensive schools. And the range in the differentiation is pretty significant, anywhere from 3%, which most of them were much higher than that, that was the lowest one, up to 85% cost differential between attending a comprehensive school and a research university. Obviously, the average is somewhere in between that at 33%. So they tend to charge 33% more to attend a research university. And I think that's a recognition of the cost structure that you encounter for many things related to that research institution, including the cost of faculty, the cost of facilities, the cost to support a research infrastructure, equipment investment, and you could go on and on. And so the board has discussed this at a number of different times. Should we have pricing that's all the same, or should we differentiate our pricing? I think we're doing a little bit of price differentiation already. It's maybe not as obvious in our tuition rates, but it certainly is obvious when you start to look at our discipline fees. We have a fairly long list of discipline fees that you'll find in our tuition and fee rate structure, and so the board is doing it maybe in a different way. It's not to say that other states aren't doing that as well, because almost every state where you see differentiation in pricing between research and comprehensives, they also have a list of discipline fees. So it's hard to assess, though, if we're doing more of that than other states or less. It really is difficult to tell, but there certainly is price differentiation in South Dakota. I don't want to lead the board to believe there isn't. It usually happens on the tuition side as well, and we've really moved away from that, and I think that leaves the door open. Is that really the direction we want to go? Should the cost structure be the same, or is there an opportunity to allow maybe the research universities to increase their price? In fact, if there is some leeway to do that or some cachet to do that, I don't know the answer. I think the universities could answer that better than I could. So the next topic that we discussed, and Paul just went into that in quite a bit of detail with a real good summary, is the cost to attend in South Dakota and the cost to attend in a surrounding state for a resident student. And that's at the top of page 2. We are currently highest out of the 8 regional states. And I think that is a concern, and it's probably why one of the board's strategic goals is to manage affordability for our students so that they can access higher education. I did have a question from Regent Morgan about, where have the cost increases been? And I provided you a couple of handouts. At the bottom of page 2, there's a summary of tuition or of total costs. He asked me if I could break that down in tuition and fees and then room and board, so that maybe you could tell where have our costs increase, and that's one of the handouts that I provided to you. I don't know that I need to go over that. I think it is interesting if you look at that. Obviously, we have to address both pieces of that. We increase tuition and fees to address the quality of education to buy equipment, to build buildings. And on the other side of that, we also have to have nice facilities for our students to live in. And we've addressed that as well. And I think the two together, in fact, we have increased our costs, but I think what we provide to students today is a much better product relative to the amenities that they get when they go to their student unions, when they live in their residence halls. So it's a balancing act of how much can you afford to increase it, and what is it that students want, and what are they willing to pay for. And so I don't know, Regent Morgan, if that really addresses where you were going with this, but. Okay. Yep. So we tried to break it down that way, and he also asked me the question of how much of what's being, the cost increase is being driven by our salary policy, and I also provided you a historical salary policy summary. So you can see what the state salary policy has been, and then there's also a column in there that I think I labeled it salary enhancement, or salary competitiveness, one of the two. And that's the program that the Regents started back in '94, I believe it was, or '98, where we simply were getting so far behind the region that we could not attract faculty, and we couldn't recruit them. And so the Regents said, we can't rely on state salary policy to get us back up there, and so what we've had to do, and it's another cost driver for us, we have actually had to increase tuition in order to fund a salary policy that was competitive within the region. And we have actually made quite a bit of ground on the regional states. We believe we would be about, I think the number's 35% behind the regional states had we not done this. We're currently about 5% behind. So I think the Regents have made the right decision. I think it goes to the issue of quality and attracting quality faculty. And so that's why the salary enhancement program was put in place. And whether or not we have to continue with it, it's base money that's being generated, so it's a fee that's already being charged, and whether we have to increase it in the future is the discussion that we'll all have to have as we watch what the states around us continue to do. The annual tuition and fee approval cycle, I think you all understand that the way that the tuition cycle or the approval process is set up is really to minimize the tuition and fee increase, and you can blame that on me or past executive directors or whatever. I don't know that it matters, but what I do when I look at a tuition and fee request proposal is I look at what do the campuses need to fund their salary policy, what do they need to fund OE inflation, and what do they need to fund any other priorities that the board has approved. So if there's a health insurance increase that's passed along to us, we have to fund that. So I look at what the actual need is, and then I determine how much of a tuition and fee increase they need in order to fund that. So the process really starts out being one of trying to minimize the increase in tuition and fees. And I think I would say that's in place for good reason. It's in place because it aligns with the board's strategic direction that they want to keep higher ed affordable. There's certainly a number of different ways that we could look at the tuition and fee cycle. We could let the campuses put forward different proposals, and we could look at them individually. But obviously, that doesn't then align with the board's goal of trying to keep it accessible and affordable. So that the process may be something that we want to look at. Is that something the board wants to change in the way that I actually bring forward a request? Now, that's just the tuition and fee side. Dr. Rush works directly with the presidents from the institutions on their general activity fee increases, on any special discipline fee increases that they have that, of course, are outside the annual tuition and fee increase. Because remember, we only look at mandatory tuition and fees. And then the board also acts on those cost items as well. And those are usually addressing specific needs at the institutions. They're not about the salary policy usually, and they're not about OE inflation. They're about supporting a discipline and needing resources to support that discipline. So we do look at that as well. And then, of course, he also works with the presidents on how much they need for room and board. If they're looking for something in addition to the normal inflationary increase, those are all reviewed by Dr. Rush, myself, with the presidents and their staff to talk about what the need is. So we look at really tuition and fees, special discipline fees, room and board, and other separately, and that's how the package gets together for the board. I would just say that we also talked about the competition for students, and I think Paul's enrollment stuff says it about all that needs to be said. The competition for students has really heated up. You see a lot of activity in other states relative to scholarships and relative to offering students discounts and scholarships. Obviously, if we're not in the game there and we're not able to offer somebody a $10,000 scholarship, and they can get that scholarship somewhere else, even if it costs them just the same as what they would have paid in South Dakota, that scholarship is very attractive. When you say it's $20,000 to go there, it's $10,000 in state, but we'll give you a $10,000 scholarship. That's a very attractive incentive. It's a mindset in many ways. So I think competition is certainly fierce, and I think scholarships is playing into this. And then also the ability of other states to offer our students in-state rates. We see more and more of that happening. Clearly, they're trying to drive their enrollments the same way that we are, and they're going after the students with everything that they can. Top of page 4, balancing state funding and tuition. You already talked about this. Obviously, as we've struggled to increase state appropriations and support for higher education in this state, our students have had to pick up a bigger part of the cost. And we already talked about that. I think Regent Thayers, you're right on. I mean, the students are having to pick up more of the cost, and that's driving us to be not as competitive as we were. I think back before that trend changed, I think we were second or third lowest in the region, and now we're 7th out of 8. So it certainly has driven our costs as we look for resources. While our tuition and fees are high and our appropriations are low, the overall resources per student remains low. We're still a low-cost state in the amount of resources it takes to produce graduates. And you can tell that from the total educational revenue per FTE. We're the second lowest in the surrounding states. We're spending $12,583 per student. Wyoming spending $20,000. That average is probably closer to $13,500. So we're still doing the presidents and the campuses are all doing a great job of producing students at a pretty low cost per student. Scholarship funding, I don't need to go into that. We're 49th out of 50 states for a needs-based scholarship program. I think that's all I need to say there. And then I would just comment on the enrollment information. You noticed that you had a revised item on the enrollments. I grabbed the tables out of that item on my way out of town to a funeral. Those tables were wrong. They've been updated. So I would ignore table A3A and A3B. The ones that Paul presented today have been revised and they're correct. So just cross them out and don't use those. You already have those in your enrollment report. In fact, when I saw my own report, because I told him to pull the tables out of there, I went into Dr. Rush's office and I said, we should be celebrating. Look at these enrollment numbers. Well, they're all wrong, unfortunately. So A3A and A3B in the enrollment report are the right numbers. These are definitely wrong. I think you would see the same thing, and the point that I was trying to make here is that on-campus enrollments continue to decline, off-campus enrollments continue to grow. While overall enrollments are fairly stable, there are a number of nuances like dual credit that are impacting it. Paul made a comment a little while ago about the fact that we have dual credit students paying a rate of $140 when we're charging $240 for a student, and that impact alone on my HEF revenue is about $400,000 a year that I'm losing that the students aren't paying into HEF. These things just start to add up after a while, and things that I'm watching in as well as Dr. Turman. So that's really the conversation we had, kind of a rehash of it in a much more brevity here. I threw out the same questions at the end. I'm not really sure where the board wants to go with it. I think you really just wanted to revisit these issues again. There certainly could be changes as we talk about the next tuition cycle. We could do things sooner, we could do things differently, and I'm certainly open to all of those ideas. As I said, the process I think works today. But what we did here at the last cycle was there were just needs to look at it in a different way, and that's why the board went a different direction than having differential. And whether we want to go back and revisit that or not, I don't know. It's certainly the board's call. So I'd be happy to try to answer questions or.
Thank you, Dr. Kramer. Regent Schieffer.
Going back to the scholarship funding, this is helpful. I would suggest probably do need to say a little more about it. There's a lot of discussion about the need-based financial support. There's merit-based finance. There's the blend. I think developing this will be important, particularly for the upcoming legislative session, but to develop the full picture, need-based, merit-based, anything else that is out there. And I guess I would just encourage a little more, dive a little deeper into the scholarship funding part of it and put it in a PowerPoint presentable format. I agree, we're way behind in that effort, but I think we could probably do a little crisper job of laying out the case and covering all the bases, because one of the first things you hear when you talk about need-based is, well, it's, but we do more in merit-based, and how do you define it and all of that. So just having that full picture, I think, would be helpful.
Yeah, actually, I had made a couple of notes, Regent Schieffer, when Dr. Turman was presenting, and I think it would be helpful to get to this point specifically. I think it would be helpful to know how much scholarship money is going to Pell-eligible students today, because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about needs-based students, and how much of the scholarship money is going to the merit student. So in other words, they're not Pell-eligible. Is there a proportion? My guess is, because they're merit-based, they're not going after the needs-based students, and those students are therefore not getting any scholarship money, or as much as. I think the other thing that would be important, based on what I saw today, is our scholarship money going to residents, or is it going to non-residents? Because something is driving those numbers, and we talked about this. Is this all cost? What is it that's driving that? And I think, I don't know the answer to those questions, and so those are a couple of things I think that would help us dissect what's going on with scholarship money. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, we're just getting a full picture, and I see very few programs that are all need-based and all merit-based. Most of them are a blend of the two, and those labels, I think, get kind of confusing. I think the main point here is this focuses on need-based, whatever definition people use, and there are different definitions out there, but so that we're comparing apples to apples and we don't run into pushback, or at least are able to answer the pushback intelligently, just developing a more fulsome picture when we're comparing with other states, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Dr. Kramer, I think the page 4 of the fiscal year budget request that we made when we met with the government, that chart has the regional merit and need-based scholarship programs. That was I think that's probably what Regent Schieffer is talking about, something that shows the comparison of what we do in need-based is very little, obviously, but what we do in merit is significantly higher than other states. It still doesn't bring us to the level total that they're doing, but not everyone got to see that chart. And I think that's what you're talking about.
That's part of it. I think there are things there are programs out there that would, you might not call need or merit-based. Show up and you get a check kind of there aren't as many of those as there might have been a while back, but it might not fit either definition. I'm just saying cover the whole waterfront.
Good point, thank you. Regent Thayers.
Dr. Kramer, my opinion, these numbers tell a pretty clear message. You look at our tuition, we're second highest, and that correlates directly to when our state began or refused or paying less of that college cost of education. You look underneath scholarship funding, the state remains at the bottom when state-funded scholarship programs. I'd also had asked you prior to give me an idea of what's been spent on institutional spending in the past 20 years for infrastructure, over $1.2 billion. Less than 4% of that's by the state of South Dakota. I think that sends a clear message what's going on.
Any other questions, comments? Dr. Kramer, thank you very much. I think what we have is the next item is actually related to this same exact topic, and we might, Monty, want to visit with you a little bit later as well if we have further discussion, but I would call Jeff Malhoff forward, item 2C1. Jeff was with the LRC, and he put together this report, and we're anxious to hear about it, so welcome.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm Jeff Malhoff with the Legislative Research Council. I am the fiscal analyst that deals with Board of Regents. And I'll just kind of go through the issue memo that we did. The executive board of the legislature requested the staff put together this regional comparison of post-secondary tuition and fees. So on page 1, you'll kind of see
Yeah, could you pull that mic just a little?
a little bit better. Okay, thank you. On page 1, you can see a tuition and fees at the 2-year institutions, and you can kind of see the trend of that over the last several years. And then on page 4 of your document you'll notice the a national ranking average of where the 2-year public institutions would amount to for the tuition and fees. And you can see South Dakota down there at number 47 with an average of $6,320. If you have any questions, just let me know. On page 5 of your document, this will get into where the average tuition and fee revenue per FTE at the 2-year public institutions. So you can see that on the chart there, South Dakota has the highest state average for revenue generated from tuition and fees at $5,591, and the regional average there is $3,452. So that tells you that South Dakota 2-year public institutions are receiving a large portion compared to the regional states from tuition and fees. Now, there are other state, other revenues that the 2-year public institutions receive, like state appropriations, federal grants and contracts, local revenues. And the reason you don't see those on the chart here is that the IPEDS data was inconsistent with the other revenue sources. For example, the IPEDS data did not have the correct information in there for the South Dakota Technical Institutes for state appropriations. So we could not use that data from IPEDS in this report, which is why you only see the tuition and fees revenue reported. Then the next, at the bottom of page 5 there, you'll see the average expenses per FTE at the 2-year institutions. And what we did here is we looked at the main core expenses. So we have instructional there in the dark shade, the medium shade is institutional support, and the light shade is other expenses. And at the back of your document there on page 11, it provides a definition of what's included in the other expenses, what is the definition of institutional support costs and instructional costs, to give you an idea of what's all included in those expenses. And this is at a per FTE basis. So you can see that the regional average for instructional was $7,180. South Dakota was $6,859. Then you can kind of see what the total there was, that South Dakota's average expenses per FTE for 2-year public institutions was the lowest amongst all the regional states on a state average basis. Turning to page 6, we'll just kind of give you a summary conclusion to the 2-year public institutions, and it kind of provides at the bottom there the amount of dollars needed to bring South Dakota's 2-year tuition and fees to the regional average level. Are there any questions on the information in the 2-year public institutions?
Regent Schieffer. We turn that on, thanks.
Yes, thank you. This is very helpful. I was trying to understand, you were mentioning some problems with the iPads revenue data, I think, as it relates to South Dakota or other sources of revenue. I'm just trying to understand that a little better and its impact on, does that understate or overstate or don't know how it impacts or?
Oh, Mr. President.
Go ahead.
The 2-year public institutions in South Dakota do not consistently report the same information to IPEDS consistently. For example, one of the public institutions, 2-year public technical schools in South Dakota, reported $0 for state appropriations, and they reported that in other grants and contracts instead of a state appropriations. So the IPEDS data, if I would have included those other revenue sources, would be misleading. So that's why we did not include those, because our 2-year public schools did not report consistently to IPEDS. So therefore, we couldn't show anything in the other 2-year schools for the other states, for other revenue sources. because our state, for sure, we know for sure, they did not report consistently to iPads.
Obviously, probably don't have any sense whether the rest of the states did or didn't, or many do or don't.
We wouldn't have had access to
Right.
whether they were or not without going to each state and asking them. So that is why you only see the tuition and fee revenue listed there on top of page 5.
So what kind of revenue would be excluded across the board?
Mr. President, other revenue sources you would have, that are included in the iPads data is state appropriations, dollars from federal grants and contracts, local revenues from probably local governments, local area, stuff like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Jeff, what this shows is that, at least for me, we can, and we're gonna look at four-year institutions next, I know, but virtually, we're not alone in this deal. We may be from a state perspective underfunded compared to the region in the Regento institutions, but our technical institutes are also underfunded compared to the region by state appropriations.
I guess I couldn't speak to that, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you.
On page 7, this is where we'll get into the four-year public institutions. At the top of page 7, you can just kind of see a historic average of the undergraduate resident tuition and fees from a state average perspective. So back in '08, you can see that South Dakota, that solid black bar there, we were the third most expensive, and fast forward to 2017, and now we're the second most expensive. And then, so if you look at that table down below there, you can see what the increase year over year has been in tuition and fees for undergraduate residents in each of the states. So that would be the average for the state's increase. So you can see that block there of 2010 through 2012, everybody was raising tuition fees at a pretty good rate. So then on page 8 there, at the top of page 8, you can see the regional tuition and fees for a state average for the resident and non-resident. So you can see where South Dakota's resident is at a state average of $8,500 roughly, and then, Minnesota would be the next highest resident at $9,888. And these numbers do not reflect any reciprocity agreements or scholarships or anything like that. This would be just what was publicly available for tuition and fees. And then you can see South Dakota, for academic year 2016 and 2017, would have had the lowest state average for non-resident tuition and fees. And then you can see the graduate there off to the right. So an aspect of this was to look at to see if a house at the average median household income in a state would how that could maybe play into a factor with tuition. And so then at the bottom down there, you can see that the regional ratio of tuition and fees to the median household income is 15% for South Dakota. And you would have maybe expected that to be lower than Minnesota, since Minnesota had a higher average tuition and fees costs than South Dakota, but it's slightly reversed there. So either our average cost was higher or our average median income was lower than what it would have reflected in the above graph. So it's just kind of an interesting way to look at it as well. Going on to page 9, here again you'll see the state average tuition and fee revenue for the four-year public institutions per FTE. And since we didn't include the other revenue sources with the two-year schools, we didn't include it with the four-year schools either. So here you would have state appropriations as well, federal grants and contracts, other revenue sources as well, but we just provided the state tuition and fee revenue since that's what we did with the two-year schools. We wanted to be consistent in that aspect. And you can see that South Dakota receives the second highest revenues from tuition and fees on a regional average basis. with Iowa receiving the most revenue per FTE. And then at the bottom down here, again, this is the average expenses per FTE at the four-year public institutions on a state average basis. And those definitions, again, ones are on page 11 that define what instructional, institutional support, and other expenses mean. You can see that South Dakota is below the regional average for instructional expense. Institutional expense is also very low. Other expenses are kind of similar to what Minnesota is. I mean, overall, South Dakota has just slightly lower than Minnesota for the lowest average expenses per FTE.
Mr. Milhoff, one question, I just want to clarify. When you say on that top chart that South Dakota receives the second highest amount in state average tuition of the region, what we're really saying is we charge our students the second highest tuition and fees in the region. We don't receive it, we charge it. We're not receiving it from any funding source other than the student. Correct?
Mr. President, you could probably refer to it in that way. I mean,
Okay,
it is the amount of revenue you receive per FTE. I mean, you could maybe say it that.
Okay, thank you. Right, thank you.
And then the final page, on page 10, just kind of wraps as a summary again. And then page 11 is just the explanation of the breakout of expenditures.
Thank you, Mr. Milhoff. Questions, comments, any thoughts? I actually appreciated it because I've never seen it side by side, the difference in the two-year institutions and the four-year institutions. So, and I'm sure that the members of the legislature wanted to see this information as well for a variety of reasons. But I think this report is valuable to me because it tells that full story of the public institutions of higher learning, technical institutes, and the Regento institutions in South Dakota. So I just want you to know, from my perspective, this report is valuable and important, and it's good information, and I appreciate you doing it. So, Regent Wink, do you have a question? Oh, I thought you had a question, I'm sorry. Any other questions or comments? Yep, Dr. Rush.
Just curious, Jeff, did you try to do the chart on the bottom of 6 for the four-year institutions?
Is that the amount of additional dollars needed?
What's that?
The bottom of page 6? Is that the amount of additional dollars needed?
Yeah.
I didn't have the total FTEs for a whole year, so for fall, summer, and spring, I just had fall, so I was not able to compute that needed number at that time. But it looks like on page 2 of the document, Monty calculated that number, what that number would be.
That's the 15.7 million, Jeff, that's on, yeah, on the bottom, the last sentence of page 2, while it's not in chart format, that number is 15.7 million to bring South Dakota to the regional average. Yeah. Yep, Regent Schieffer.
Kind of a similar question, this regional tuition and fees on page 8, when you do the percentage ratio, is that something, do you have the information or able to do that with the 2 years?
Mr. President, regarding the household income?
Yes.
We didn't do that for the 2 years for this issue memo. But I mean, that information would be available. You could do the same ratio, yeah.
That's just okay, thank you.
Other questions, comments? None, Jeff, thank you very much. Thanks for the report and the information. Discussion, Regents, on, we asked to have this brought back only because, well, a couple things. Obviously, tuition and fees and how we compare and what we do here is important, obviously, and important part of the work we do in the discussion we have. Also, we kind of got down and didn't have the full time to discuss it at the end of the retreat. and we have a few minutes today, if we want to have, any observations or thoughts on this information, if we want to digest it and talk about it, we get plenty of chances to talk about this, but to me, it's very telling information. I mean, we look at what our regional comparison states and our regional states are doing. And we know, as we look back, Monty, I think this sheet that you handed out at the request of Regent Morgan, from FY 2000 to FY 18, the average tuition and fees and total cost increase. I just looked at the tuition and fees. Just like almost every other state in Jeff's report, if you look at those green boxes, it was like from 2000 to about 2011, everyone was flying kind of high. The average tuition increases during that really 13-year period was 7.1%. Since that time, they're 2.28%. And most states, if you look at that chart that Jeff had with the green boxes, show the same thing. I mean, things literally dropped off when the economic recession, economic downturn, hit. And since that time, states have had difficulty in funding, and we've tried to do everything you can to be competitive, obviously, from a tuition standpoint. So the difference between 7.1 and 2.28 increase is significant when you compare those stretches of time. So other thoughts, comments? Monty, anything else you would like to share?
No, that's a great observation, and the board has done what they can the last 5 to 7 years. We've gone after tuition freezes with the legislature. We were successful 2 years doing that. The board went from the 128 to 120. That was, an average of $2,500 worth of savings to a student. And just managing the tuition fee increases every year is how we got down to that 2% that you just mentioned. So, it's a combination of things that are happening. The legislature gets some credit for funding a couple of tuition freezes, and the board gets a lot of credit for managing those increases every year. It's kind of gets us where we're at today, because obviously there are needs in there that the institutions have to make sure that they have the resources to provide a quality education. And there's the issue of affordability, and we're balancing that. And of course, that gets even more difficult when you're balancing that when your enrollments are really stagnant. If we had growing enrollments, I think you would be hearing less about the need to increase tuition fees.
President Sutton, if you look at the graph on page 9 of the last, I think that's pretty much telling when we're talking about efficiencies, how do we create more efficiencies? And we're already second lowest in the region in average cost to produce an FTE. How do you get a whole much more efficient than that? There's certainly always challenges to do that, but to me, it tells me we're doing a pretty good job of administering our education. But when we're the second highest in what we charge our kids, something's wrong there. I think it's pretty evident.
Thank you, Regent Thayers. Other comments?
In other words, 15.742 million is what we need.
Each year.
Each year.
Each year, yeah. Yeah, that one time wouldn't fix it, would it? No. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Thoughts on this or any of the other items that were on the agenda for today for the workshop? Excellent presentations, good data. There's a lot of information here. So these are the kind of sheets that I like to keep because these are the kind of questions we get asked often, and it's nice to have this information. Dr. Rush, anything you'd like to kind of close with today?
Well, I do think that these are absolutely critical questions that the board's going to have to wrestle with, because we do have a number of institutional needs. The state money, it doesn't look like that they're going to have $15 million to give us this next year to balance out that need for tuition. And we do have critical needs with salaries of our faculty, with programs for student success that we've talked about. And I think we're going to have to, I think it goes back partly to what Regent Thayer's comment was, is that obviously it looks like there's a strong correlation between the fees increases that we've had and the depression in the enrollments and those sorts of things. So if it were just a simple matter of increasing fees, in other words, if we knew we could increase fees by $10 a credit hour and then we would be able to acquire that income, that would be one issue. But there's probably a reason that Walmart doesn't just increase their prices 10% across the board, because people might go to Costco. And so I think that that's one of the things that we really struggle with, is trying to find what that competitive point is and where is it amongst the needs that were created and the amount of money that we can increase our fees that won't be offset by decreased enrollments. And I just think that that's something that we as a system are going to have to continue to wrestle with. And unfortunately, we're not wrestling with it alone. We've got all our competitive states that are also looking at ways to increase their share of South Dakota students that are going to their institutions. And so this all becomes quite a marketing challenge.
Sure. And I think that's a good point, Dr. Rush. Dr. Kramer, I actually have a question that I'm not going to ask it very articulately, because number one, I'm not very articulate. Number two, I'm not quite sure what I'm asking. But how do we calculate in the average tuition when we include those students that are paying the rate for dual credit? Does that bring down that average? You know what I'm trying to get to actual cost. I still contend that program is intended to be a low-cost entry point for people that we want to get into our system. And I'm not sure, it's like selling gas 2 cents under what it costs you, so people will go inside and buy a Snickers bar and a Diet Coke. And that's where you're gonna make your real money. But people are paying at the pump, and saving 2 cents and driving away is sort of a picture that I have in my very simple mind. So how do we calculate that in?
Well, we don't. All of the cost comparisons that you saw today are all based on an undergraduate resident student who's paying the full rate. I think you've certainly seen the Black Hills State University has put together the cost to a degree program that does take those things into consideration. You know, if a student comes to us with so many dual credit hours and they take so many hours per semester, they can complete a degree, you know, for X costs. So they have taken those things and packaged them and explained to students, if you take advantage of all of these opportunities, you can get a degree, and I'm not going to say the number because I don't remember it, but less than what we advertise publicly. So we don't consider that when we're doing the cost for an undergraduate resident, just straight across the board. What does it cost for an undergrad resident student?
Sure. And I think that's appropriate. I'm just making sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that some of the students that are showing up on our campuses are getting a better deal than that, because they've ended up getting 20 credit hours, maybe a full semester, I'll say 15, 16 credit hours at the lower dual credit rate or AP courses or whatever it might be. But they may be showing up with credits that they're not paying the full freight for. And many of them are. We've got 3,000 students taking those courses now. I think the other thing for this discussion, and maybe not for today, but is to really for the 9 members of the Board of Regents and certainly the senior staff to have input is, you know, when we read that 46, if I remember the number right, 46 states have a differential between research institutions and comprehensive institutions. I fully understand that the paint's hardly dry, the ink's hardly dry on the resolution that was passed, and that we equalized those on the tuition side. But I think it's a worthwhile conversation, and at least thought as we look at how we do tuition. Is it unfair? That's a discussion that we all have to have and discuss, but obviously in 46 states, it has not been deemed to be unfair, and it wasn't necessarily unfair when we did it here the first time. I think those are things that we just need to keep in mind as we're looking. I also think tuition differential, meaning not just the differential between comprehensive and research institutions, but just the difference between what an institution wants to get done and what they want to do and what they think it will do for their own institution and what others think they might want to do. And so the fact that institution A and institution B always will have the same tuition may be something we just need to think about.
Well, and there was a reason at one time why we had the same tuition rate, because we had a tuition pool.
Right.
And everybody put their money into the pool, and why would one campus want to pay in more than another? And so we don't have that anymore. Campuses keep their own money, and I think it lends itself to that opportunity to say, do the rates need to be the same? What can you charge without impacting enrollments? What's that comfort level? And so I'm certainly open to that. The way that we have moved these things forward in the past has been an understanding that we will have these rates the same, and it doesn't need to be that way. And I'm certainly willing to take direction from the board. If you want to let the campuses bring forward their tuition proposals, we can certainly do that. The difficulty will be balancing that from the perspective of affordability and the rates. And the campuses know that better than I do. They know what they can afford to charge and what the market looks like for their students.
And I think that's the key. And I'm right now neither advocating for or against. I'm just thinking conceptually, it's something that we as board members need to keep in mind, that if we want our presidents and their senior staff at the universities to be entrepreneurs, they're going to price themselves in the market where they think they're going to be able to sustain, they're going to be able to provide education, fund the things they want to do, and attract students. If they price themselves out of the market, they'll have no one to blame but themselves. I mean, so how entrepreneurial do we want our universities to be is a question, conceptual question. Or do we just say, nope, here's what you can charge? I know you've got discipline fees, I know you've got other things, but on the tuition side, we're going to tell you that you have to provide an education for this amount. And I think that's a philosophical question, probably not for today, but as this discussion goes on, I think that's what I would like to be thinking about. Yep, Regent Thayers.
I mean, I think the big picture here we need to remember is we are a huge industry, a big business of South Dakota, and I think we don't tell that very well. I mean, this report comes out as a Regental system created over $1.2 billion in economic impact to the state of South Dakota. We have requested 215 some million from the state budget. Look at that return. Now to say another 15 million gets us close to whole or gets us even close to average, I understand state budgets are tight in what we have to work with, but an overall scheme of what the return is, I think it would be a heck of a good investment for the state of South Dakota. And then you look at, for each kid that takes every additional year of education, it's direct correlation that their pay is greater, their chance of success is greater. It's all very positive message. And I think whether it's educating our legislators or governor, but that kind of ask is not out of line.
Anything else for the good of the order today?
Mr. President?
Yes, Regent Morgan.
Yeah, maybe for future discussions, maybe, again, discipline fees, just to maybe bring those back up, have a summary report on those, and what percent of the total cost in different disciplines are the discipline fees versus the base tuition and that sort of thing, because, that is one way to differentiate without changing the tuition, and I don't know, and maybe just one question on that. Are similar discipline, are the discipline fees the same? I'm just gonna pick, for example, engineering at SDSU and School of Mines, are the discipline fees for the same type courses the same there, or are they differentiated between the institutions?
Well, 2 years ago, we did standardize the rates for most of the discipline fees.
Okay.
I think chemistry is still different between the schools. I mean, there are a couple that are different that the campuses have looked at and said, why are they different? But for the most part, they are standardized. There are a few differences, but not many. And that's pretty typical. I mean, if you get a high-cost discipline like engineering, it's high cost at both institutions
It'd be
in this
similar.
case. So we see a pretty strong correlation between those discipline fees between the institutions.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious, and again, I'm not necessarily thinking they all have to be the same, I was just curious where we were there.
We bring discipline costs and show you how they impact the overall cost of an education for that student. And we haven't done that for a while. I know we've done it in the past, but that's easy to do.
Okay.
Just to add to that, and to reemphasize what Monty said, 2 years ago, they did go through the financial folks went through a major effort to look at all the discipline fees. But even last year, when we went through the discipline fee requests, one of our primary criteria was how consistent is this fee across the system? In other words, were we charging the additional extra cost for similar programs at multiple institutions? So we brought a few more in line as well.
Okay, if there's no further comments, again, thank you to for the presentations today. We will stand in recess. Regents, we will go into executive session at 5:30 according to the agenda today, so we'll do that. And the public meeting will come back into session at 1 PM tomorrow afternoon, right here. So thank you all very much. I don't think we don't adjourn, we just go into. Oh, thank you, sorry. Thought you were talking about adjourning. Sorry about that, Regent Bastian. I would love a motion to go into executive session.
I just happen to have one that I've memorized over the
Figured you would.
last 60, 90 days, and I hope I get this right. I move that the Board of Regents dissolve into executive session at 5:30 PM on Tuesday, October 3rd, 2017, to discuss personnel matters, that it adjourn at 7:45 PM, that it reconvene in executive session at 7:30 AM on Wednesday, October 4, 2017, to discuss personnel matters, pending and prospective litigation, contractual matters, marketing or pricing strategies by a board of a business owned by the state when public discussion may be harmful to the competitive position of the business, and to consult with legal counsel, all as shown on the published agenda, that it rise from executive session at 12:30 PM to resume the regular order of business, and that it report its deliberations while in executive session during the appropriate board agenda item. And that is my motion, Mr. President.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Sign. That motion carries. We are now in recess.
Thank you.